Manhattan, Financial District. Sarah Mitchell, single mother and night janitor at Sterling Industries, was cleaning the executive floor when she heard crying from the CEO's office. She found Alexander Sterling, the ruthless billionaire who terrorized Wall Street, holding a 6-month-old baby while reading a custody letter. His sister had died, leaving him guardian of a nephew he'd never met. When he saw Sarah, still in her janitor uniform with her own 5-year-old son asleep on the office couch, he made an offer that stopped her cold. "Marry me for 1 year. Help me raise this baby. I'll pay off your son's medical bills and ensure he gets the heart surgery he needs." Sarah looked at him, this broken titan of industry, then at the baby in his arms. Her response changed everything. But when Alexander discovered that Sarah was actually the whistleblower who'd exposed his father's crimes 20 years ago, sending him to prison and destroying her own career in the process, their business arrangement became something neither had anticipated. The 42nd floor of Sterling Industries was supposed to be empty at 2 a.m. Sarah Mitchell had cleaned these offices for 3 years, always in the dead of night, when the masters of the universe were home in their penthouses, leaving only the ghosts of billion-dollar deals and the faint smell of expensive cologne. Sarah, 32 years old with exhaustion etched into every line of her face, pushed her cleaning cart through the executive suite. Her son, Tommy, 5 years old and fighting a heart condition that required surgery they couldn't afford, slept on the leather couch in the break room. It was summer break. Her babysitter had quit, and Sarah had no choice but to bring him along, praying security wouldn't notice. She was emptying the trash in the CEO's office when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Sarah froze. In 3 years of cleaning Alexander Sterling's office, she'd never seen evidence he was even human, let alone capable of caring for a child. The man was legendary for his ruthlessness, for destroying companies with a signature, for firing entire departments via email. The crying grew louder. Sarah approached the inner office door, which stood slightly ajar, spilling golden lamplight into the darkness. Through the gap, she saw a scene that defied everything she knew about Alexander Sterling. The billionaire sat behind his massive desk, his usual pristine suit wrinkled and stained with formula. In his arms, held with the awkwardness of someone handling a live grenade, was a baby, no more than 6 months old. Papers were scattered across the desk, legal documents with words like custody and guardianship, visible even from a distance. Alexander Sterling, 38 years old and worth $15 billion, looked utterly lost. His phone was on speaker, a woman's voice saying something about emergency foster placement and documentation required, before he ended the call with visible frustration. Sarah must have made a sound because Alexander's head snapped up. Their eyes met across the office, and for a moment, neither moved. She expected anger, immediate termination for being where she shouldn't be. Instead, she saw something she'd never imagined in those cold gray eyes: desperation. The story tumbled out in fragments as Sarah, against every instinct, entered the office. Alexander's younger sister Diana, whom he'd been estranged from for a decade, had died in a car accident 3 days ago. She'd left behind a son, Lucas, and a will naming Alexander as guardian. The baby had been delivered to his office an hour ago by a social worker who'd tracked him down through Diana's papers. Alexander held the crying baby like it might break or explode. Sarah watched for 30 seconds before her maternal instincts overrode her self-preservation. She crossed the room and gently took Lucas from his arms, adjusting his position, checking his diaper, finding a pacifier in the diaper bag the social worker had left. The baby quieted immediately, and Alexander looked at Sarah like she'd performed magic. That's when he noticed Tommy sleeping on the break room couch, visible through the glass wall. The question in his eyes was clear. Sarah's defenses crumbled as she explained in short, bitter sentences. Single mother. Tommy's father had vanished when the heart condition was diagnosed, working 3 jobs to pay for medications, The surgery that cost $200,000 might as well be $2 million. She'd brought Tommy tonight because she had no choice, knowing it could cost her the job she desperately needed. Alexander studied her with the intensity that had built his empire. Sarah could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the risk-benefit analysis, the solution forming. When he spoke, his proposition was delivered with the same cold precision he used for billion-dollar mergers. A marriage of convenience. 1 year, legally binding but purely business. Sarah would live in his penthouse, help him raise Lucas, teach him what he needed to know. In exchange, Tommy would have the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country. All medical bills covered, a trust fund for college, everything a mother could want for her sick child. After a year, a quiet divorce, a generous settlement, and they'd go their separate ways. Sarah's first instinct was to laugh, but the sound died in her throat when she looked at Tommy through the glass, his face pale even in sleep, the medication bottles visible in her purse that she couldn't afford to refill. Then she looked at Lucas, innocent and orphaned, and Alexander, trying so hard to seem in control when he was clearly drowning. But she had to tell him something first, something that would probably end this conversation immediately. Sarah took a breath and revealed the truth she'd hidden for 20 years. She wasn't just a janitor. She'd been an SEC investigator, one of the youngest ever hired. And 20 years ago, she'd been the one who'd exposed Richard Sterling's massive fraud scheme, sending Alexander's father to federal prison, where he'd died 5 years later. The color drained from Alexander's face as he processed this information. His father's conviction had destroyed his childhood, sent his mother into a depression she never recovered from, scattered his family to the winds. And the woman standing in front of him, holding his nephew, offering to help him, was the one who'd lit the match that burned it all down. The silence stretched between them, heavy with history and hurt. Lucas gurgled in Sarah's arms, and Tommy stirred on the couch. 2 children who needed things their guardians couldn't provide alone. Alexander's response surprised them both. He said his father was guilty, had destroyed countless lives with his fraud. Sarah had done the right thing, even though it had cost her everything when Richard Sterling's connections ensured she'd never work in finance again. Perhaps, he said with bitter irony, it was fitting that they help each other now, both casualties of his father's crimes. Sarah looked at this broken billionaire, at the baby who needed a mother figure, at her son who needed surgery, at the strange hand fate had dealt them. Her answer would change everything, but she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that sometimes salvation comes in the strangest forms. 1 year, she said quietly, for the children. Alexander nodded, and in that moment, 2 enemies became the unlikeliest of allies. The marriage happened 3 days later in a judge's chambers in Lower Manhattan. No white dress, no flowers, just signatures on papers while Tommy played with a toy car and Lucas slept in his stroller. The only witnesses were Alexander's lawyer and Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd agreed to watch the children during the brief ceremony. The move to Alexander's Fifth Avenue penthouse was surreal. Sarah and Tommy went from a studio apartment in Queens with spotty heating to a 3-story palace in the sky with views of Central Park. Tommy's eyes were wide as saucers as he explored, his excitement temporarily masking the fatigue that was his constant companion. Alexander had prepared everything with corporate efficiency. A bedroom suite for Sarah and Tommy, a nursery for Lucas that looked like it had been assembled by a team of experts overnight, which it probably had. There was even a live-in housekeeper, Margaret, a stern woman in her 60s, who looked at Sarah with barely concealed suspicion. The first week was a disaster. Alexander tried to approach fatherhood like a hostile takeover, with schedules and metrics and performance indicators. Lucas screamed through his attempts at bottle feeding. Tommy, overwhelmed by the change and feeling worse as his medication ran low, had tantrums that left everyone frazzled. Sarah felt like an imposter in designer clothes Alexander's assistant had purchased, playing a role she didn't understand. Everything came to a head when Tommy collapsed during dinner. One moment he was laughing at Lucas blowing bubbles in his formula. The next, he was on the floor, his lips turning blue. The ride to Mount Sinai Hospital in Alexander's Bentley was the longest 10 minutes of Sarah's life. As they waited during Tommy's emergency procedure, Sarah broke down completely. She told Alexander everything. How Tommy's father, a trader at a hedge fund, had seemed so perfect until the diagnosis came. How he'd accused her of lying about the pregnancy to trap him, despite 3 years of marriage. How he'd emptied their accounts and disappeared, leaving her with medical bills that destroyed her credit, her savings, everything. Alexander listened in silence, then made a call. Within an hour, the head of pediatric cardiology was explaining Tommy's treatment plan. The surgery was scheduled for the following week with the best surgical team in the country. When Sarah tried to thank him, Alexander cut her off. "It's part of our agreement," he said, but his eyes were soft as he watched Tommy sleeping in the hospital bed. That night, back at the penthouse after Tommy had been stabilized and admitted for observation, Sarah found Alexander in Lucas's nursery, trying to read a board book about farm animals with the seriousness of someone analyzing a quarterly report. Lucas was not impressed, fussing and squirming. Sarah took over, showing Alexander how to hold the book so Lucas could see, how to make the animal sounds, how to use different voices. As she demonstrated, she told him about Diana's visits to the office over the years, always at night when she knew Alexander wouldn't be there, leaving birthday cards he never opened, Christmas gifts he donated unopened to charity. Diana had been pregnant and alone, too proud to ask for help from the brother she'd sided against when their father was convicted. She'd worked as a teacher, raised Lucas alone, never telling Alexander he had a nephew. The car accident had been instant, the social worker said. At least Lucas had been at daycare, safe. Alexander's carefully constructed walls cracked as he talked about the sister he'd lost twice, once to anger, once to death. Sarah found herself comforting the billionaire, who'd probably never allowed anyone to see him vulnerable. In that moment, they weren't CEO and janitor, but two people who'd lost too much. Tommy's surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in August. The night before, Alexander canceled a board meeting worth millions to stay at the hospital. He sat with Sarah in the surgical waiting room, not speaking but present, his laptop closed for once. When Dr. Harrison emerged after 6 hours with news of complete success.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Sarah collapsed against Alexander's shoulder, sobbing with relief. He held her awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, his hand stroking her hair as she released months of terror and exhaustion. Tommy's recovery was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, he had more energy than Sarah had seen in years. He attached himself to Alexander with the fierce devotion of a 5-year-old, following him around the penthouse, asking endless questions about buildings and business, declaring he wanted to be just like Uncle Alex when he grew up. Alexander, for his part, seemed bewildered but touched by the hero worship. He started coming home earlier, teaching Tommy to play chess, reading him stories about knights and dragons with the same intensity he brought to quarterly earnings calls. Lucas, growing rapidly, began recognizing voices, reaching for Sarah whenever she entered a room, calling her Mama in baby babble that made her heart ache. The media noticed, of course. Sterling's secret family blazed across the business blogs. Paparazzi caught them in Central Park, Alexander pushing Lucas in a stroller while Tommy rode on his shoulders. The board of Sterling Industries was not pleased, especially Victoria Blackwood, the vice chair who'd been maneuvering to push Alexander out. Victoria leaked the story of Sarah's past, painting her as a gold digger who'd destroyed the Sterling family once and had returned to finish the job. The headlines were vicious. The janitor who brought down an empire returns for more. The crisis erupted during a charity gala at the Met. Sarah, dressed in a gown that cost more than her former annual salary, stood beside Alexander as Victoria Blackwood approached with predatory grace. Victoria's attack was surgical, mentioning Sarah's interesting past loudly enough for nearby reporters to hear, questioning how convenient it was that she'd been cleaning the exact office where Alexander would need help with a baby. The implication was clear. Sarah had orchestrated everything. But Alexander's response stunned everyone, including Sarah. He took the microphone and told the entire room the truth. Yes, Sarah had exposed his father's crimes. Yes, it had destroyed his family. And yes, she'd been right to do it. His father had stolen billions, destroyed retirements, ruined lives. Sarah had sacrificed her career to stop him, and the Sterling family had used their influence to ensure she'd never work in finance again. "I hired her as my janitor," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "because she was the only honest person in a building full of thieves. I married her because she's the only person I trust to help me raise my sister's son. And I'm keeping her because—" He paused, looking at Sarah with something that wasn't quite business anymore. "Because she's teaching me how to be human again." The video went viral within hours. But more importantly, Victoria's attempted coup failed spectacularly when the board saw public opinion swing massively in favor of Alexander's honest revelation. Fall arrived with Tommy starting kindergarten at a prestigious private school, healthy for the first time in his life. Lucas was crawling, saying his first words, calling both Sarah and Alexander Mama and Dada indiscriminately. The penthouse had transformed from a sterile showplace to a lived-in home, with toy cars on the coffee table and crayon drawings on the refrigerator. Alexander had changed too. The man who'd once fired entire departments by email now knew every employee's name on the executive floor. He'd implemented childcare services at Sterling Industries, flexible working hours for parents, and a healthcare program that covered pre-existing conditions. The board was horrified, but productivity had increased 30%. Sarah had started taking online courses to finish her economics degree, the one she'd abandoned when her career imploded. Alexander had offered to pull strings to get her into Columbia, but she'd refused. She'd earn it properly this time. One evening in October, as they performed their nightly routine, Sarah bathing Lucas while Alexander helped Tommy with homework, Margaret the housekeeper made an observation that changed everything. "You know you're in love with each other, don't you?" she said bluntly, watching them work in perfect synchronization. This stopped being business months ago. Sarah and Alexander looked at each other across the room, Tommy chattering about dinosaurs, Lucas splashing in his bath, and realized Margaret was right. Somewhere between hospital visits and bedtime stories, between board meetings and baby formula, they'd become a real family. But their contract said 1 year, and that year was almost up. The conversation that night, after the boys were asleep, was the most honest they'd ever had. Alexander admitted he'd been in love with Sarah since she'd stood up to Victoria at the gala. Sarah confessed she'd fallen for him the night he'd cried, holding Diana's picture, telling Lucas about the aunt he'd never know. But Sarah had a condition. No more contracts, no more business arrangements. If they were going to be together, it had to be real, messy, complicated, and genuine. Alexander agreed, then did something that stunned her. He pulled out the original marriage contract and tore it up, just as she'd probably wanted to tear up that first check he'd offered her father's victims 20 years ago. "Marry me," he said, getting on one knee in their kitchen, holding a ring made from a toy car wheel that Tommy had given him. "Not for business, not for the boys, but because I love you, and I can't imagine life without your chaos, your honesty, your courage." Sarah said yes, crying and laughing simultaneously. The second wedding was everything the first wasn't. A year after that night in the office, they stood in Central Park with Tommy as ring-bearer and Lucas toddling down the aisle throwing flowers everywhere but where they should go. Mrs. Chen was there, along with Margaret, the entire night cleaning crew from Sterling Industries, and, surprisingly, half the board of directors. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. Alexander wore a suit with a juice stain on the lapel from Lucas's breakfast mishap. Tommy proudly announced to everyone that his mom was marrying his dad for real this time, which caused confusion among guests who didn't know the whole story. In his vows, Alexander thanked Sarah for saving him twice, once from his father's legacy of corruption, and once from becoming his father. Sarah thanked Alexander for showing her that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances, that janitors and billionaires can find common ground in love for children who need them. The reception was held at Sterling Industries, on the 42nd floor, where it all began. The night cleaning crew danced alongside Wall Street titans. Tommy performed an elaborate dance he'd choreographed himself, while Lucas tried to eat the wedding cake with both hands. As the evening wound down, Victoria Blackwood approached. She'd been ousted from the board after her failed coup, but came to offer unexpected congratulations. "You know," she said to Sarah, "I hated you for exposing Richard Sterling. He was my mentor. But watching what you've done with Alexander, with the company, with those boys, maybe some things needed to be destroyed so better things could be built." 2 years later, Sarah graduated with her economics degree and joined Sterling Industries not as a janitor but as head of their new nonprofit division, focusing on helping single parents escape poverty. The program was revolutionary, providing childcare, education, and job training. Within 5 years, it had helped thousands of families. Tommy, now 8 and healthy, had decided he wanted to be a doctor, to fix other kids' hearts. Lucas, 3 and talking nonstop, followed Tommy everywhere, calling him his best brother in the whole world, even though they shared no blood. The night of the nonprofit's 5th anniversary gala, Sarah stood on the same stage where Victoria had tried to destroy her, now speaking as a respected leader in corporate philanthropy. Alexander watched from the audience, Lucas on his lap, Tommy beside him, his eyes full of pride. In her speech, Sarah told their story, the real one, how a janitor and a billionaire found each other in the middle of the night, both broken, both desperate, both needing something the other could provide. How business became family, how family became love, how love became a legacy that would outlive them all. The initiative she announced that night, the Diana Sterling Foundation for Orphaned Children, would ensure that no child would grow up without family, without hope, without someone to hold them in the middle of the night when the world felt too big and too dark. As she left the stage to thunderous applause, Sarah found Alexander waiting in the wings. "You know," he said, pulling her close, "when I offered you that contract, I thought I was saving you." "And?" Sarah asked, smiling up at him. "And you saved me instead. You saved all of us." They kissed as Tommy and Lucas ran to them, creating a group hug that nearly knocked everyone over. In the background, New York glittered through the windows, the same city where a desperate billionaire had met a desperate janitor, where 2 broken families had become one whole one. The tabloids had finally gotten bored with their story, moving on to newer scandals. But in the offices of Sterling Industries, the legend lived on. How the night janitor had become the queen of the empire, not by marrying the king, but by teaching him that empires built on love are the only ones worth having. Margaret, now retired but still visiting weekly, would tell anyone who listened that she'd known from the beginning. "You could see it," she'd say, "in the way they moved around each other, like dancers who didn't know they were dancing." And in the penthouse on 5th Avenue, as another night fell over Manhattan, the Sterling family settled into their evening routine. Alexander read to Lucas about dragons while Sarah helped Tommy with his science project about the human heart. Later, after the boys were asleep, they'd stand on their terrace looking out at the city lights, still amazed at the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked one night, holding Sarah as they watched the city sleep. "Everything you gave up to expose my father?" Sarah turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd gone from stranger to employer to husband to soulmate. "How can I regret the thing that eventually brought me you, brought me our boys, brought me home?" And that was the truth of it. Sometimes the worst decisions lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes janitors marry billionaires not for money, but for love. Sometimes broken families rebuild themselves stronger than before. Sometimes, when you're cleaning offices at 2 a.m. with your sick child sleeping on a couch, destiny walks in holding a baby and changes everything. Hit like if you believe love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Comment with the moment that touched your heart the most. Share with those who need to know that sometimes help comes from the most unlikely sources. Subscribe for more stories that prove family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up when life falls apart. Because in the end, the decision that stunned everyone wasn't the billionaire's proposal. It was the janitor's courage to say yes to love, despite their painful past, proving that forgiveness and second chances can build empires stronger than money ever could.